Do you see me? Can you hear me? Hello. Oh, today we're talking about senses. Now, vision and audition are a couple important senses, but things are far more complicated. For starters, the ear isn't just responsible for hearing, it's also responsible for a sense of balance. Taste and smell, of course, are other senses you're familiar with, as is touch, but touch isn't a special sense, it's a general sense. And we need to get to the bottom of why that is. So we'll start with some terminology around sensations and sensory receptors. We'll also talk about taste and smell pretty briefly. And the next two videos will look in detail on these very fancy and interesting senses of audition, balance, and sight, vision. So we start with this introduction, and we need to get down super basic terminology like sensation and perception. So, sensation is this input about our world obtained from our sensory receptors. Perception is what the brain does to this information. So, it brings it in, it organizes it, interprets it. You know about the association areas we discussed previously in the brain. So, this is a subjective process, right? Meaning, like, I don't know if what you think tastes like chicken to me, you know? We're both starting with the same input, but what our brain does to it is kind of hard to say. Maybe you were not raised in a culture that eats chicken, and then so there's all this like background information that the brain uses. And then if you can read this little paragraph, and I bet you can, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but this stuff is very interesting. Like looking at something like this and understanding how our brains process language, but how they use this input and they process it and sort it and integrate it. And it's very cool stuff. We'll really stick to the basics though. Like, what do these sensations look like at a cellular level and stuff like that? So the other thing we need to know about before we get into the details is sensory receptors. What are they? So these receptors can look very different, but they're all specialized cells and they're in the peripheral nervous system and they respond to stimuli, different types of stimuli. You can classify these in a bunch of different ways. Let's say location, structure, and function for starters. So if we have a sensory receptor, uh, basically, you've got some in your body, some outside your body, and then these other special ones. These sensory receptors that are inside, let's do outside first, are outside your body that are stimulated by the external environment, meaning vision and smell and hearing and things like that. Those are exteroceptors. So outer stimuli can activate them. Interoceptors are internal. So as an example, I put stretch receptors in the bladder. But of course, there's tons of stuff that your body is constantly monitoring. Everything from, stretch receptors in the bladder to like circulating levels of sugars. Proprioceptors are this kind of weird thing in between. It's kind of like a combination in that they determine where your body is in space, the position and movement of your body parts. It's not balance. I don't want this picture to indicate balance. It's more like the fact that if you go into a really pitch black dark cave or you wake up from sleep, you still know the position of your joints, regardless of whether or not you can look down and tell and see um, whether your arms are flexed or extended. Your body is sensing this information with proprioceptors. So, those are three ways to classify all of these different sensory receptors. But you can also look at their structure or their structural type. Like basically, if you take one of these sensory receptors and look at it under a microscope, what does it look like? If it's really basic, we call it a free nerve ending. That's when you've just got this neuron and the dendrites reach up towards something and there's nothing special, nothing fancy, no extra structural elements. It's just a free, meaning a bare nerve ending. So this is like what we have in the skin for pain and temperature. Like pain is pretty basic. If you crush or cut or traumatize these free nerve endings, it's interpreted as pain. You can kind of wrap something around the end of those neurons, though, around those dendrites, like some connective tissue sheathing to enhance the sensitivity. And then you've got an encapsulated nerve ending. We saw that with the lamellated corpuscles in the skin, is a good example, the tactile corpuscles, and there's lots more. But if you want to get really fancy, then you'll have these specialized receptor cells that have distinct structural components to interpret a specific type of stimulus. We're talking about special cells that all they do is they accept the stimulus. And then they're going to hook up with some other cells to take that information back to the nervous system. But they're kind of on their own, little isolated cells, and all they're doing is just collecting that information. So, hair cells, which we'll talk about a lot in this chapter, and photoreceptors, rods and cones, are examples of these specialized receptor cells. And we can see all three types here with these free nerve endings just being those dendrites totally bare and exposed. Encapsulated nerve endings have some type of connective tissue sheathing or structural element. But then look at this specialized cell. It's doing its own thing. It's not going to do double duty. It's not going to also carry the signal back to the nervous system like these other ones. It's specialized to receive. It's a specialized receptor cell. And then it relies on a secondary neuron to help carry that information. So those are all structural types of sensory receptors. But functional types is where we start to get more into the terminology that we're used to seeing. So chemoreceptors, for example, all sense chemicals. Taste and smell are nothing more than these chemicals being picked up by receptors in your body. But don't forget that other chemoreceptors in your body are things like those monitoring stations for like blood oxygen level or CO2 level. They're monitoring the fluids in your body for different chemicals. Those are also chemoreceptors. Nociceptors sense pain, and there's all kinds of good stuff to learn about that. Maybe if you take a psychology course, more about the perception of pain. I did some studies at Mass General when I worked there for extra money, and I did a pain study where they would just give you this unit that would get extremely hot and extremely cold and sense your pain tolerance after they did different things to your body. Yeah, it was worth it, I think. So, nociceptors, important. Mechanoreceptors sense mechanical changes. So we can just say physical stimuli. And this is a bunch of stuff. So this is pressure, vibration, and stretch, which are all elements of touch. But also hearing and balance are physical stimuli. And we'll see when we look more at hearing and balance how like there are physical changes happening inside your body when you're hearing or balancing. Thermoreceptors, of course, sense temperature. Photoreceptors sense light. And we'll talk more about those, rods and cones. There is, however, one other way you can classify sensory receptors, or maybe it's easier just to think of how are we going to classify all these different senses in the body? Like, so we've talked about, you can say, okay, there's these five senses, right? Touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. And those have been around like a long time. Like Shakespeare talks about them, and then 2,000 years before that, there's like an ancient Hindu text that talks about these same five senses. So they've been known for a while, but the thing is, like with touch, we just mentioned that there's these vibrations and then there's stretch. We learned when we studied the skin that there's light and deep receptors for touch. So that's all a little bit more complicated. Then there's stuff like proprioception. And what about the sense of hunger or thirst? You know, are those senses or not? And I don't know. So there's still debate about what exactly we should classify as a separate sense and what the rules around that are. But what we'll do is just say that when we think about these senses, we want to try to capture them either in the general senses bucket or the special senses bucket. And general senses will have receptors widely distributed throughout your body. So, like you've got skin widely distributed, all those touch receptors, they're part of your general senses. They are pretty simple, especially now looking at things like pain and temperature. Those are free nerve endings. The touch, some of those are encapsulated nerve endings, but they're relatively simple structures. And the information will be sent to the parietal lobe. That's kind of our default sensory lobe. And there's the primary sensory cortex there on the postcentral gyrus. So those are general senses. It's almost easier just to think of what are the special senses, because those are the ones that have receptors only at specific areas. They have very complex structural elements. And so that's where we're talking about four of the five senses, these five senses: vision, hearing, taste, and smell. And then don't forget balance. So the special senses is what we'll really be talking about. And we'll look quickly at a couple of those right now. We'll look at taste first, and the formal official anatomy medical term for taste is gustation. So these gustatory receptors are a type of chemoreceptor. We mentioned that earlier. There are such a thing as taste buds. So taste buds are real. They're found on your tongue and in a few weird spots, like on the back of your hard palate and on your epiglottis, which we'll talk about later when we do the respiratory system. But, it's like deep back, almost in your throat. And I don't know. Sometimes I feel like maybe I can taste something back there. Yeah. So they're pretty interesting. They're found mainly on the tongue, though, of course. And the job here is that as you create saliva, it will help trap these chemicals from the food you eat and from the air. And you want to try to trap them in this saliva so that they will be exposed to the taste buds. And you can't see the taste buds. If you look at your tongue and you see all those little bumps on the surface of your tongue, those are papillae. And you've heard that term before, meaning nipple shaped. So those little bumps are papillae. The taste buds are found in and on and around those papillae. The papillae, I had to look this up because I knew that from working with wildlife, that some of the big cats and stuff, they'll use these really large, sharp hooked papillae to like pull the meat off bones and to keep like mice from wriggling back up out of a cat's throat or something. They face backwards. So I knew about those papillae, but I wasn't sure about the human function. So I looked it up recently, and the research all suggests it's actually for us to hold saliva. If we had these slippery, smooth tongues, the liquids would just kind of slide off them very easily. You want like a real thick, salivated tongue to help make sure you're capturing those molecules to get them onto your taste buds. So those are papillae. One other myth is about the taste areas on the tongue. I have to look this up too, like every couple years, and then I see all the papers, and it's totally 100% like you don't sense sweetness here and bitter in the back or whatever they say. But I was taught it for sure as a kid. I think they're probably still teaching it. If you look on Wikipedia or Google something, you would be led to think that was true. But there aren't these regions of taste. Spend more than a minute looking that up, and you'll find all the scientific references that show that. But what can we taste? Five tastes for sure: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and this relatively newer discovered umami taste, which is a Japanese word meaning more or less savory. So those are tastes. There is research ongoing right now that we may have a separate taste buds for fats, which makes sense to me, but we're not sure about that yet. Uh, it's pretty incredible, but just with these five different receptors distributed in different places, you get this overall pattern of firing these cells will result in all these different tastes. And we're born with more than 10,000 taste buds, but those do decline with age. And you'll hear a lot that as people get older, they start to season their food more heavily with sodium, basically with a lot of salt. And that can cause problems with blood pressure and stuff. So looking here we can see one of these taste buds. You would have the saliva up here. You want the little bit of saliva dripping into this orifice to pull the molecules down into the taste cells. And in some cases, those will fire and send that stimulus towards the central nervous system. And more specifically, we've got cranial nerve 7 and 9, facial and glossopharyngeal, that will carry that information back to the brain. The major sense of taste is processed by the gustatory cortex in the insula, or that insular lobe tucked kind of behind the temporal lobe. But uh, portions of that signal will split off and go to the hypothalamus, which gets its hands in everything, and the limbic system. And remember, the limbic system is a spattering of parts of the brain that all have to do with emotion, some other stuff like memory. And so it's there that we have this appreciation of taste. So that's taste. Olfaction is somewhat similar. It's also a chemical sense. So your smell receptors are chemoreceptors. And that might not surprise you if you know about the close relationship between taste and smell. The organ of smell, it's not taste buds or smell buds, it's the olfactory epithelium. It's on the roof of the nasal cavity, and it's this. It's basically like another mucousy layer, but instead of little taste buds, you have all these branches of these olfactory receptor cells. We'll have another picture of this on the next slide, but your goal is to get those odor molecules that land in that mucus. The nasal concave will help with that because remember, these make the air real turbulent. So it'll expose more odor molecules to the olfactory epithelium. And if those molecules meet up with a receptor and they fire a signal, it'll travel up through the cribriform foramina, those holes in the ethmoid bone, and into these little short olfactory nerves here. So cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, is really, there's a bunch of little nerve branches going through the cribriform foramina. Because once you get through that portion of the skull, that ethmoid bone, now you're up in the brain. So remember, nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. Once you get up into the brain, now you're in the central nervous system. So now you've got this olfactory bulb. There's some special cells in there called mitral cells that will pick up the signal, carry it into the olfactory tract, and deeper into the brain. And we can see that again, or the text of it here. Mucus traps the odor molecules. Those are actually bipolar neurons, are your olfactory cells. They have little cilia on the ends. They have receptors on the cilia to capture the odor molecules. Those cells give the signal to the mitral cells. Signal goes through the olfactory bulbs to the olfactory tracts to the olfactory cortex in the temporal lobe. Remember this, temporal lobe is somewhere around here. It processes the sense of hearing, of audition, and also the sense of smell. This information too goes to the hypothalamus and the limbic system. So again, we're getting into emotion and memory. It also goes to the amygdala, which is, I think, interesting because that's like a fear center, but also a sexual arousal center. So smell has got all kinds of crazy things going on. Okay, so that's it. We've got some basic terminology down, mostly about sensory receptors. We talked about the difference between a general sense, widely distributed, pretty basic receptors, and special senses, very specific locations, very complex structures. And the chemoreceptors we just talked about, gustation and olfaction, not super fancy, but as we do vision, hearing, and balance over the next two videos, you'll see things get lots more complicated. Good time.